The night of April 5th to 6th, 1585. The Scheldt River. It was late. The moon was low and the river flowed in silence, or almost silence. In the dark, at the water's edge, there was the noise of soldiers stomping their feet on the timber to keep warm, the clinking of armor, the murmur of men who had kept the same watch many nights in a row, and didn't expect this one to be any different. The smell of smoke from campfires mixed with that of the cold water. Somewhere upstream, the city was starving. Here on the bridge, it was routine. Then someone yelled, "Fire ships." This night seemed like all the others. In a few hours, it would kill nearly 1,000 men, and the city being defended would fall anyway. Burning boats floating down the Scheldt. The scene was familiar. It had happened before. The Dutch kept trying, kept sending incendiary vessels hoping to reach the bridge and cause some real damage. The Spanish soldiers knew what to do. They grabbed their long poles, their iron hooks, positioned themselves along the structure, and deflected the ships as they arrived. It was a procedure, a routine. On the Scheldt, dozens of burning boats drifted down toward the bridge, lighting up the surface of the water in orange and red. Thick smoke rose, forming a fog of war that made visibility impossible beyond 100 feet. On the Dutch side, the confusion was purposely rehearsed, a manufactured chaos to divide the defenders' attention. And it worked. Along the entire length of the bridge, the Spanish were busy, each group focused on the nearest fire ship, each man with his pole in hand, each captain shouting orders that got lost in the noise. In the midst of all that confusion, two ships kept drifting down the river. On the outside, they were indistinguishable from the rest. Old wooden hulls, visible flames, black smoke rising. The kind of vessel the soldiers had already deflected dozens of times in those weeks of siege. On the inside, and this the soldiers couldn't know, couldn't see, couldn't even imagine, they carried something that didn't exist in any war manual of the time. A weapon that didn't burn. It destroyed. What happened when the first of these ships touched the bridge was heard over 25 miles away. In a fraction of a second, nearly 1,000 Spanish soldiers were erased from existence. Duke Alessandro Farnese, general of the greatest empire in the world, the man who ruled the destinies of a network that stretched from the Americas to the Philippines, the commander who had engineered the most skillful siege in Europe, was thrown to the ground by the shockwave. The central section of his bridge was destroyed. The path was open, and the Dutch didn't advance. This is the story of the Hellburners, the ships of hell. It's the story of a weapon that had never existed before, of a genius that Spain discarded, and who then turned his creation against them, and of the night when everything was on the verge of changing, and didn't. One of the greatest tactical victories of the 16th century that turned into a strategic defeat because of something no engineer can design: human hesitation. Trust me, it's not the story you think you know. But to understand why those nearly 1,000 men were on that bridge that night, and why the man who sent them there never saw what was coming, you need to understand what Antwerp represented to the world in 1585. In 1585, Antwerp wasn't just a big city, it was the economic heart of all Europe. The port of Antwerp handled more goods than anywhere else in the Western world. Spices from the East Indies, textiles from England, silver from the New World, diamonds from Africa, grain from the Baltic. It's estimated that during that period, roughly a third of all European trade passed, in some way, through Antwerp. Bankers from all over Europe had branches there. Merchants from dozens of nations lived within its walls. It was the place where fortunes were built, where empires were financed, where the money that moved the world circulated faster than anywhere else on the planet. And it belonged to the Spanish crown. Or at least it had. Since 1566, the Netherlands, which included what is now Belgium and the Netherlands, had been in rebellion against Spanish rule. It was the beginning of what history would call the 80 Years' War. The Protestant northern provinces refused to bend the knee to King Philip II of Spain and the Catholic Inquisition he represented. Antwerp, a city of commercial temperament and religiously diverse, had aligned itself with the rebels. For Philip II, this was unacceptable. Antwerp wasn't just a symbol of power, it was a fundamental source of revenue. Losing it to the rebels was an economic and political humiliation that Madrid simply couldn't absorb. The war in the Netherlands was costing fortunes, and Antwerp was an essential part of the revenue funding that very war. More than that, whoever controlled Antwerp controlled the North Atlantic trade. And whoever controlled the North Atlantic trade dictated the terms of the world. So he sent his best man. Alessandro Farnese, Duke of Parma, was probably the most skilled military commander in Europe at the time. He wasn't a general who won through brute force. He was a strategist, someone who understood that wars are won just as much by logistics and positioning as by direct combat. In 1584, he began the siege of Antwerp with a methodical coldness that would soon reveal why the city was doomed. He didn't attack the walls. He didn't attempt an all-out assault. He simply started cutting off every route through which the city could sustain itself. Antwerp's problem, from the Spanish point of view, was geographical. The city was located inland in the Flemish region, but it was connected to the North Sea by the Scheldt River, a vital 60-kilometer artery that linked its ports to the rest of the world. As long as this connection existed, the city could be resupplied. It could survive. It could resist. Farnese understood this with absolute clarity. How do you starve a city that sits on the banks of one of Europe's great rivers? You cut off the river. The problem was that cutting off the Scheldt was no simple task. At that point, the river was over 800 meters wide. It flowed with a significant tidal force that reversed the current's direction twice a day. Its depths were shifting and treacherous, and any structure built across it would need to be more than just functional. It would need to be able to withstand constant attacks. Because Farnese knew that as soon as construction began, the Dutch would try to destroy it with everything they had. Experienced engineers said it was impossible, that no available material could withstand the currents, that the distance was too great, the depth was all wrong, and the time required far exceeded what any siege could afford. But in February 1585, the bridge was finished. Calling it a bridge is almost an understatement. It was a feat of military engineering unprecedented in 16th century Europe. 2 floating platforms extended from each bank and met in the middle of the river, forming a barrier roughly 800 meters long. But the structure went far beyond simply connecting the 2 shores. It was designed to resist, not just to exist. At regular intervals along the bridge's entire length, Farnese had positioned reinforced wooden towers, raised high enough so that archers and musketeers could cover the river in every direction. Between these towers, submerged iron chains stretched below the waterline, designed to snag the hull of any boat trying to slip under or around the main structure. It was a trap disguised as a bridge. On the surface, angled masts and rope nets created additional obstacles that would force any attacking vessel to slow down, just long enough to become an easy target for the defenders. The ends of the bridge on both banks were protected by earthen forts armed with heavy artillery. Cannons covered every angle of approach along the river. A permanent garrison of soldiers kept continuous watch, day and night, with rotating shifts to prevent the fatigue that leads to lapses in attention. To the contemporaries who saw it, Farnese's bridge was an absolute marvel. Engineers from all over Europe wrote about it with a mix of technical admiration and disbelief. Chroniclers described it as something that shouldn't have been possible. For those on the Spanish side, it was proof that Alessandro Farnese could make the impossible seem inevitable. For those on the Dutch side, it was a nightmare of stone, iron, and wood stretched across the only path to salvation. The first Dutch attempts to destroy it came quickly. Conventional fireships, boats loaded with dry wood, straw, and pitch, set ablaze and released into the current. It was an old tactic, but it had worked before in other contexts. Not here. The Spanish garrison on the bridge was prepared and well-trained. Using long holding spears and metal grappling hooks, they pushed the burning hulls away before they could get close enough to cause any real damage. The few that did touch the pillars were repelled before the fire could catch on the main timber. Inside Antwerp, the situation worsened with every passing week. Food supplies dwindled irreversibly. The price of provisions skyrocketed to levels that most of the population couldn't afford. Rations were cut, then cut again. By mid-1585, the starvation was real, concrete, and etched into the faces of the people on the streets of Europe's richest city. Ordinary fireships weren't enough. Everyone knew it. If no conventional weapon could break Farnese's bridge, what kind of weapon could? Federico Giambelli had a proposal, and no one in Spain wanted to hear it. Giambelli was an Italian engineer, born in Mantua, possessing a brilliant mind that the 16th century didn't quite know how to handle. While traditional commanders focused on cavalry formations and infantry blocks, Giambelli thought in terms of pure physics, chain reactions, and how to subvert nature itself to use it as a weapon. He was the kind of person who looked at a military problem and saw an engineering problem, and who believed that engineering problems had solutions, as long as you were willing to think unconventionally enough. He wasn't the kind of innovator who worked within established frameworks. He was the kind who questioned why the frameworks existed in the first place before proposing how to change them. Sometime prior to the events of 1585, he had arrived at the Spanish court with a proposal. The exact details haven't survived with all the clarity we might like, but the outline of the story is well documented. Giambelli presented King Philip II, or his representatives in Madrid, with a proposal for unconventional weapons. Something unlike anything the Spanish army used. Something that could fundamentally change how naval and siege warfare was fought. Philip II refused. Perhaps the Madrid bureaucracy deemed the idea too extravagant, expensive, and risky. Or perhaps Giambelli, an Italian outsider with no noble lineage or political patrons, never even made it past the waiting rooms of Philip II's ministers. Perhaps the Spanish army, at the peak of its power and historical confidence, simply couldn't imagine that it needed innovation. After all, the Spanish tercios were considered the most fearsome fighting force in Europe. Why fix what wasn't broken? Giambelli left. And what this man, rejected and ignored by the greatest military power in the world, did next was seek out the enemies of that power. He spent some time in England, where he explored possibilities but hadn't yet found the right project. Then he arrived in Antwerp, when the desperate city began looking for creative ways to break Farnese's blockade. Giambelli was available, with a design he had developed and refined for years, waiting for exactly the kind of problem the 800-meter bridge on the Scheldt represented. The city of Antwerp and the states of the Netherlands didn't know for sure what they were commissioning, but Giambelli knew exactly what he was building. It was the answer to the question no engineer had been able to solve: how to destroy a structure that ordinary fireships couldn't touch. The weapon that was about to cause the largest explosion seen in Western Europe in many decades was the weapon the King of Spain had dismissed as unnecessary. Philip II had rejected the technology. Now that technology was being built in Antwerp, pointed directly at his best soldiers. The enemy had created their own threat by ignoring it. And now, in some shipyard on the banks of the Scheldt, Giambelli was finishing building something the men on Farnese's bridge could never even imagine. To understand what Giambelli built, you first need to understand what a conventional fireship was, and why it had fundamental limitations that made it ineffective against Farnese's bridge. The standard incendiary vessel of the time was basic: old hulls stuffed with lard, loose gunpowder, and oil-soaked ropes, sent out with the tide against the enemy fleet. The intent was purely thermal, to start an uncontrollable fire in the target's wooden structures. The problem lay in the chain of dependencies. You needed the ship to collide with the target, the fire to be intense enough not to go out upon contact with wet wood, and the defenders not to have enough time to interfere. Against a structure like Farnese's bridge with alert guards, deflection poles, and underwater chains, a conventional fireship was neutralized before it even got close enough to cause damage. Giambelli designed something that belonged to a completely different category. Outwardly, his creations looked like ordinary merchant ships. Nothing extraordinary, the kind of vessel that regularly sailed the Scheldt, carrying cargo between Antwerp and the sea. The conventional appearance was deliberate, an essential and non-negotiable part of the plan. The enemy needed to believe they were fireships right up until the moment that belief no longer mattered. But inside, each of these two vessels was a machine of destruction built in carefully calculated layers. In the central chamber of each ship, Giambelli piled up approximately 3,200 kilograms of gunpowder, the equivalent of 7,000 pounds. To put that into perspective, the largest cannon of the period fired a gunpowder charge measured in kilograms, dozens perhaps. Giambelli was working with tons. The quantity was so massive that the ships themselves had to be reinforced internally to support the weight without sinking before reaching the target. Above and around the barrels, he packed tons of material designed to turn into a storm of shrapnel upon ignition. Millstones, cemetery tombstones, scrap iron, and bronze. The choice was deliberate and calculated. The millstone, heavy and irregular, would be launched in unpredictable trajectories. The tombstone, dense and flat, would cut through the air like a blade. The combination wouldn't just create the expansive force of an explosion. It would create a storm of lethal fragments in every direction, maximizing human casualties well beyond the immediate radius of the detonation. But the most critical innovation, the one that definitively separated the Hellburner from anything that came before, wasn't the explosive itself. It was the detonation mechanism. Previous fire ships were activated by fuses. The problem was simple. They could be extinguished by the river water. They could burn out of sync with the calculated timing, and if an enemy soldier reached them, the ship was neutralized in seconds. Giambelli used a mechanical clock. It was a familiar technology at the time. Clock towers had existed for centuries, but it had never been applied to a weapon of this scale and with this purpose. The clockwork mechanism was connected to the ignition system, set to go off at a specific moment, regardless of what was happening around it. The implication for the bridge's defenders was devastating and unanswerable. You couldn't push the ship away and consider it neutralized. If the clock was ticking, the explosion would happen at the programmed time. The only way to stop the detonation was to reach the internal mechanism, and no one could possibly know it existed until it was too late. The Hellburner was indefensible by any methods the Spanish knew. And there was one final layer to the plan, one that made defense even more difficult. Giambelli didn't just send the two Hellburners. He disguised them within a larger fleet of ordinary fire ships. Dozens of conventional fireboats were rigged and launched into the river first, creating widespread chaos, forcing the bridge's defenders to spread out along the entire length of the structure, to use their poles and hooks on all sides simultaneously, to focus their attention on multiple threats at once. The Spanish soldiers on the bridge that night weren't facing a weapon. They were facing a system, and they were being manipulated into not recognizing the difference. Later, accounts would say that at least one commander on the bridge sensed something was different that night. That one of the approaching ships seemed too heavy, riding lower in the water than it should, moving with a momentum that didn't match its appearance. A fire ship didn't behave like that. Fireboats were light, burning from the inside out and riding high in the current. Not that one. But the river was already swarming with other burning vessels. Shouts of warning echoed across the expanse of the water. Soot stung their eyes, blinding the defenders to any threat beyond the nearest sparks. The suspicion, if it ever really existed, was drowned out in the chaos and urgency of the defense. What followed was a battle of nerves that lasted for hours. One fire ship after another reached the bridge and was deflected. The crews worked in unison along the entire length of the structure, redirecting the burning vessels with the efficiency of men who had done it many times before. The continuous blaze bathed the river in an orange glare. The thick air choked their lungs and smothered the voices of the captains, whose orders could barely rise above the roar of the flames. It was exhausting. It was chaotic. But it was working. Just another night of fire ships. Just another thwarted Dutch attempt. And then, amidst all this manufactured chaos, two ships continued drifting down the Scheldt. They were slightly heavier than the rest, lower in the water, moving with a different inertia that the river's current made noticeable to anyone who knew what to look for. But in the confusion of the moment, in the smoky darkness and the noise of the containment battle across the whole length of the bridge, the Spanish soldiers had no way of knowing. A fire ship was a fire ship. The Hellburner that historians call the Fortune continued toward the bridge. The garrison that intercepted it with their hooks probably never knew what lay beneath the deck. You know what's going to happen. The men on the bridge that night didn't. The Fortune bumped against Farnese's structure. Somewhere deep inside the ship, a small metal mechanism completed its rotation and released the ignition. Giambelli's clock had been ticking the whole time. In the early hours of April 6, 1585, the ignition reached 3,200 kilograms of gunpowder. What came next wasn't a fire, nor was it an explosion by the standards the soldiers of the time knew, the firing of a heavy cannon or the blowing up of a powder magazine. This was a detonation of a magnitude completely unprecedented in the military history of that era. It was the sound of an era ending. Contemporary accounts describe the sound as a thunderclap that shook both banks of the river simultaneously. Chroniclers recorded that the blast rattled structures dozens of leagues away, in towns where the inhabitants were completely unaware of the ongoing battle. That the pillar of fire rose so high it illuminated the fields well beyond the horizon. That stones the weight of a grown man were hurled hundreds of meters. That tombstones and fragments of iron and bronze rained down over an area stretching for square kilometers around the point of detonation. That those who survived on the edges of the bridge described the moment as the end of the world, a light and a sound that did not belong to the reality they knew. The central section of Farnese's bridge was destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed. The current of the Scheldt immediately began to flow through the gap, running free for the first time since the construction had been completed months earlier. The Spanish in the central part of the bridge, the ones working to deflect the fire ships, the ones closest when the Fortune detonated, did not survive. Historical estimates vary depending on the source, but the most careful calculations point to between 800 and 1,000 soldiers killed in seconds. Not in a drawn-out battle, not in a siege that lasted weeks, in a single instant of total destruction. Alessandro Farnese was on land, in the small fort on the southern bank when the detonation occurred. The explosion's shockwave ripped through the solid air and hit him with enough force to throw him to the ground. Not a shrapnel wound, the raw, sheer pressure of the blast. He was alive, but stunned, possibly unconscious. Spain's tactical mastermind, the architect of that meticulous siege designed for over a year, lay unconscious in the dust. The second Hellburner, named Hope, detonated some distance from the main bridge, in a suboptimal position. It caused considerable destruction and more casualties, but missed the central structure. Giambelli's plan had worked partially, but critically. One of the two weapons had fulfilled its purpose exactly. The Scheldt was open. The bridge was broken. The Spanish command was in chaos. Farnese was down. The Dutch fleet was waiting upriver. But what would happen in the coming hours would decide everything. Not with gunpowder, but with something Giambelli could never have engineered. Imagine standing on the deck of one of the Dutch ships at that moment. The flash of the explosion had arrived first. A light that wasn't from the sun, white and absolute, lasting less than a second, but searing itself into your vision. Then the sound, like a blow to the chest, not heard but felt through lungs and bones. And then the silence of those still processing what had just happened, pierced by the unmistakable chaos of an army that had lost its center. On the Spanish side, unanswered screams, unreturned orders, the sound of structures collapsing into the water, fire spreading across what was left of the bridge's timber. The breach was visible from there. The Scheldt flowed freely through the gap. The path was right there, concrete, real, wide enough to pass through with the supply-laden ships that Antwerp had been expecting for months. The city was just a few miles away. On the other side, families waited for any sign that this night had been different. Imagine holding the order to advance and not being able to give it. On the Dutch side, a fleet was positioned exactly for this moment. The plan had been set for weeks. As soon as the Hellburners detonated and blew a breach, the ships would advance through the gap, break the blockade, and reach Antwerp with supplies and reinforcements. The city would be saved. The Dutch ships didn't advance. What happened, or what failed to happen, in those hours remains one of the greatest strategic enigmas of the 16th century. Historical accounts diverge on the details, but converge on the outcome. Some reports speak of communication failures. The signal to advance wasn't given in time, or it was given but didn't reach the right vessels. Others point to command hesitation. The Dutch leaders, witnessing the brutal magnitude of the explosion, were paralyzed, unable to act with the speed the moment demanded. There are also accounts that some ships tried to advance, but that the wreckage of the destroyed structure and the complex currents of the Scheldt made navigating the gap harder than planned. preventing a coordinated force from organizing in time. What is historically clear is that the window was real. In the minutes immediately following the detonation, the Spanish side was in genuine chaos. Farnese was on the ground. His officers were dazed, unsure if their commander was alive, lacking a functional chain of command to replace him. The bridge's central structure had been obliterated. There wasn't a force organized enough to defend a passage through the gap at that critical moment. But the moment wouldn't last forever. Alessandro Farnese, despite being hurled against the stonework of the fort, despite severe contusions, despite the physical shock that would have downed any man exposed to such an air displacement, was Alessandro Farnese. He stood up. Eyewitness accounts from the time describe him resuming command within minutes, raising his voice with enough authority to be heard above the chaos, shouting orders, identifying the resources he still had available, and focusing the remaining defenders to cover the open gap in the bridge. There weren't enough engineers, there wasn't pre-cut timber, there wasn't a documented contingency plan for this exact scenario, but there was a commander standing. And when the surviving Spanish soldiers saw Farnese on his feet, shouting orders with the authority of someone who refuses to accept collapse as an option, they stopped running. The Dutch window of opportunity began to close while indecision persisted across the river. In the following days, under Farnese's personal direction, Spanish crews began working on rebuilding the bridge. It was a task that seemed impossible given the conditions. Few resources, a structure destroyed at its center point, morale shattered by the magnitude of the losses. The bridge was rebuilt. The blockade was restored. Subsequent Dutch attempts to break the structure, with other means, other tactics, other attacks, all failed. The Hellburner had worked. The city fell anyway. And the reason didn't lie in Giambelli's engineering. It lay in the hours that followed the explosion, when the side with the advantage stood still. And the side that had lost almost everything in seconds was kept standing by the sheer willpower of a single man. Giambelli's story didn't end in Antwerp, and the story of the Hellburners, in a way, didn't either. On August 17, 1585, Antwerp opened its gates to Alessandro Farnese. The terms of surrender were relatively lenient. Farnese was a refined negotiator as well as a general, and he understood that a ruined city emptied of its productive population was worth far less than a functional one. The Protestant inhabitants were given 2 years to liquidate their assets and leave in peace. The city formally returned to the control of the Spanish crown. But the world that returned to Spanish control was no longer the same. The fall of Antwerp triggered a series of consequences that rippled across Europe with remarkable speed. England, which had been watching the conflict in the Netherlands with growing concern, knowing that a Spain controlling the entire northern European coastline would be an existential threat, signed the Treaty of Nonsuch in August of that same year. With that treaty, Queen Elizabeth committed regular British troops to support the Dutch rebels. For Philip II, this meant that his war in the Netherlands now directly involved the greatest naval power in the North Atlantic. 3 years later, in 1588, Philip II launched the Spanish Armada against England, and Federico Giambelli had gone to England. There's a deep irony to this outcome. The naval architect of Antwerp was recruited by the British Crown, tasked with fortifying the English coast precisely against the Armada that his invention had helped instigate. There are well-documented reports that the Spanish commanders of the Armada were warned that Giambelli was in England, working for the English, and that part of the Spanish nervousness as they approached the British shores came directly from the fear of finding more Hellburners waiting for them. It wasn't unfounded paranoia. In the decisive battle in the English Channel in 1588, the English used fire ships against the Spanish Armada anchored off Calais. Not exactly Hellburners, but the incendiary vessel tactic that Giambelli had executed so catastrophically 3 years earlier. The mere fear that those burning ships could be Hellburners was enough for the Spanish commanders to break their defensive formation and flee into the open sea in panic, a move that exposed them to devastating winds and currents. The disorganization directly contributed to the disaster that followed. Giambelli didn't even need to launch a second weapon. The reputation of the first was already enough to change the course of a battle. Giambelli lived his final years in England, in the service of the British Crown, building the defenses the country feared it might need to use. The man who had designed the most destructive weapon of his time died far from Italy, far from Antwerp, recognized by few, feared by those who knew his name, ignored by the country that had the chance to hire him and chose not to. For generations after 1585, any naval commander who came across fireships had to ask themselves the same question: are these ordinary ships, or are they Hellburners? Gimbelli's design had introduced a new dimension of fear into naval warfare. Not the fear of an enemy you can identify and quantify, but the fear of a weapon that looks ordinary, that you can't distinguish from the others until the very moment the clock completes its rotation and it's too late. Because a weapon, however revolutionary, however devastating, however precise in its execution, doesn't decide wars alone. It creates moments. It opens windows. What you do with that window is a human question, not an engineering one. Spain turned this man away, and then faced the consequences for decades. If you've made it this far, you know that this channel doesn't tell the same story everyone else tells. Leave a like. It helps more people find the channel. And subscribe. The next story carries just as much weight as this one, and it starts in a place you won't expect. See you then.